A little girl's world shattered when her uncle and aunt cruelly cast her out after her parents' funeral. The streets became her home, the sky her only roof, until a mysterious millionaire appeared at the most unexpected moment. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the recently restored mansion, its warm light unable to penetrate the heaviness that hung in every corner. 7-year-old Tiffany Reynolds stood alone on the marble steps, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the cold stone. Her eyes, swollen and red-rimmed from days of crying, stared vacantly at the manicured lawn where she had once played catch with her father. Just 3 weeks ago, now silence reigned, interrupted only by the occasional whisper of adults who thought she couldn't hear them discussing her fate. The little girl tugged at the black dress that itched against her skin, a dress bought hastily for the funeral she still couldn't comprehend. "Your parents are in heaven now," the neighbors had told her. But heaven seemed impossibly far away when all Tiffany wanted was to feel her mother's arms around her again. The night of the fire remained fragmented in her mind, a collection of terrifying images that visited her in nightmares. She remembered the smoke first, thick and choking, seeping under her bedroom door. Then came her father's voice, urgent and frightened in a way she'd never heard before. Richard had scooped her up from bed, wrapped her in a blanket, and carried her through the burning hallway. "Stay with Mrs. Peterson," he had instructed, placing her in the neighbor's care. His face, illuminated by the orange glow of flames consuming their home, had been resolute. "I'm going back for Mom." Tiffany had watched from the neighbor's porch as her father disappeared into the inferno. The firefighters arrived minutes later, but it was already too late. Neither Catherine nor Richard emerged from the collapsing structure. Now, orphaned and bewildered, the child clutched her teddy bear, the only possession salvaged from her former life. The world around her seemed impossibly vast and empty, populated by adults who spoke in hushed tones and avoided her gaze. Her Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Mark had reluctantly taken her in, but their home felt nothing like the warm sanctuary her parents had created. The sound of raised voices drifted from inside the house, Sylvia arguing with someone on the phone about the burden they'd inherited. Tiffany pressed her teddy bear closer to her chest, seeking comfort in its familiar softness. She didn't understand the words inheritance or guardian that kept floating around her. But she understood the cold glances and impatient sighs that greeted her whenever she entered a room. The little girl sat down on the step, her legs dangling above the ground, and wondered if the hollow feeling inside would ever go away. Sylvia Matthews emerged from the house, her flashy red jacket catching the morning light as she dragged Tiffany's small suitcase behind her. Her face, heavily made up despite the early hour, twisted with undisguised irritation. Richard's sister had made it clear from the funeral onward that her niece was an unwelcome burden, but today her patience had finally snapped. "This ends now," she announced, flinging the suitcase onto the damp lawn. The clasps burst open upon impact, scattering Tiffany's meager possessions across the grass. The 7-year-old watched in horror as her teddy bear, the last gift from her mother, landed in a muddy puddle. Mark stood in the doorway, arms folded across his chest. His thin lips curled into a smirk. Unlike his wife, he didn't even pretend to feel remorse. The unemployed man had spent the past week complaining about the extra mouth to feed, though he contributed nothing to the household himself. "But where will I go?" Tiffany whispered, her small voice barely audible. She hugged herself tightly, trying to appear as small as possible, a habit she'd developed since coming to live with her aunt and uncle. Sylvia's laugh was sharp and cruel. "That's hardly my problem, is it? Nothing but trouble since you arrived. The bills, the nightmares, the constant crying. You're bad luck, girl." "Bad luck indeed," Mark echoed, stepping forward to stand beside his wife. "Your parents die, and suddenly we're supposed to pick up the pieces? We never asked for this responsibility." Tiffany took a hesitant step toward her teddy bear, but Sylvia blocked her path. You know what I think? The woman hissed, leaning down until her face was inches from the child's. I think that fire was your fault. Strange how you survived, while my brother and his wife didn't. Tears welled in Tiffany's eyes. Daddy saved me. He told me to run and spare me your stories, Silvio interrupted. Just take your things and go. The neighbors will take you in, or social services, or whoever. I don't care anymore. Mark laughed, the sound hollow and mean. Maybe they'll find you a nice orphanage. Isn't that where unwanted children belong? Tiffany flinched as if struck. The couple's words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. She had lost everything. Her home, her parents, and now the only family she had left was casting her out like garbage. Please, she begged, reaching for her aunt's hand. I'll be good. I won't cry anymore. I promise. Sylvia yanked her hand away, disgust evident in every line of her face. Too late for promises. You've been nothing but a burden since you arrived. Now get out. Tiffany collapsed onto the cold, damp ground, her small hands trembling as she reached toward Sylvia. Please, Aunt Sylvia, don't make me leave, she begged, her voice breaking with each word. I don't have anywhere to go. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt beneath her knees as she pleaded. Sylvia's painted lips curled into a cruel smile. Your parents aren't here to coddle you anymore, she spat, her eyes devoid of compassion as she glanced at the neighbors peering over their fences. Without warning, she marched toward the side of the house, her heels clicking against the concrete path. You're nothing but a burden, Mark added, folding his arms across his chest. We never wanted you here. His passive stance contrasted with his wife's active cruelty, yet his words cut just as deep. When Sylvia returned, she dragged the garden hose behind her, the green rubber snake slithering across the lawn. The 7-year-old's eyes widened in disbelief as her aunt turned the faucet with a violent twist. The first blast of icy water hit Tiffany square in the chest, knocking her backward onto the grass. Maybe this will wash away your bad luck, Sylvia laughed, directing the powerful stream at the child's face. The water was freezing, a shocking punishment that left Tiffany gasping and sputtering. From behind their fences, 3 neighbors watched in horror, their faces twisted with concern. Yet not one stepped forward to intervene. A woman in a blue cardigan covered her mouth, another neighbor lowered his eyes, and an elderly man shook his head but remained rooted in place, all silenced by Sylvia's reputation for vindictiveness in their small town. Soaked to the bone, Tiffany crawled toward her scattered belongings. Her clothes were now muddied, her few treasured books ruined. With shaking fingers, she reached for her teddy bear, the last gift her mother had given her before the fire. The stuffed animal was sopping wet, its once soft fur matted and dripping. She clutched the bear to her chest, not caring that it soaked her further. The toy was all she had left of Catherine, a tangible reminder of being loved. Tiffany's small shoulders heaved with sobs as she looked up at her relatives. Mark's laughter echoed in her ears, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Sylvia's hateful glare burned into her, the woman's eyes reflecting nothing but contempt for her brother's child. But perhaps most painful was the silence, the heavy, complicit silence of the neighbors who watched but did nothing. In that moment, surrounded by her drenched possessions and cradling her soaked teddy bear, Tiffany felt the full weight of abandonment crush her 7-year-old heart. She was alone in the world, cast out by the only family she had left, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The harsh scrape of Tiffany's small hands against the wet concrete driveway echoed in the evening air as she gathered her soaked belongings. Her fingers trembled, blue with cold, while tears mingled with the water dripping from her hair. The neighbors had retreated behind their curtains, unwilling witnesses to her humiliation. Suddenly, the distinctive growl of an engine cut through the tense silence. Headlights swept across the yard, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a cruel stage. A sleek, black luxury vehicle rolled to a stop at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the porch lights. The car door opened with deliberate slowness. Albert Warren emerged, his tall frame unfolding from the driver's seat with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. The renowned heart surgeon stood for a moment, taking in the tableau before him: the soaking child, her scattered possessions, and the smug faces of Sylvia and Mark on the porch. "What in God's name is happening here?" Albert's voice carried across the yard, not shouting, but resonating with authority that seemed to physically push against the evening air. Sylvia's smile faltered. Mark took an instinctive step backward. "Richard entrusted his daughter to you," Albert continued, walking toward Tiffany with measured steps. "Is this how you honor his memory? By throwing his child into the street?" The surgeon knelt beside the trembling girl, removing his expensive coat and draping it around her shoulders. The warmth of the garment enveloped Tiffany like an embrace, the first gesture of kindness she had felt since the funeral. "We were just disciplining her," Sylvia called out, her voice suddenly honeyed with false sweetness. "Children need boundaries." Albert's eyes narrowed as he stood, positioning himself between Tiffany and her tormentors. "Richard was my closest friend for 20 years. He would be devastated to see his daughter treated this way." His words struck Tiffany's heart like a bell, clear and resonant. Someone remembered her father. Someone knew what he would have wanted. "This is family business," Mark called out, puffing his chest. "You have no right." "I have every right," Albert interrupted, his voice dropping dangerously low. "As Richard's executor and Tiffany's godfather." The revelation hung in the air. Tiffany looked up at the man standing before her, this stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel. Her father had chosen him. Through the fog of her misery, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. "Pack your things, Tiffany," Albert said gently, not taking his eyes off Sylvia and Mark. "You won't be staying here anymore." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Sylvia's face contorted into a mask of saccharine concern as Albert Warren approached. Her red jacket seemed to glow with defiance in the fading light. "Albert, what a surprise!" she cooed, voice dripping with false warmth. "We were just teaching Tiffany some discipline. Children need structure after trauma." Albert's piercing gaze traveled from the soaked child to the garden hose still clutched in Sylvia's manicured hand. His expression remained glacial. "Is this what you call discipline?" he asked, his tone cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Drenching a 7-year-old orphan with cold water while her belongings lie scattered across the yard?" Neighbors peered over fences, emboldened by the millionaire's presence. Sylvia's smile faltered as she realized her audience had grown. "You don't understand," she stammered. "She's been impossible since the accident." "Fire," Albert corrected firmly. "Not accident. The fire that took Richard and Catherine from her." Mark stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a show of authority that looked comical against Albert's composed presence. "Listen here," Mark growled, jabbing a finger toward the heart surgeon. "We're her legal guardians now. We decide how to raise her. This is family business." Albert's voice remained level, but carried an undercurrent of steel. "Family doesn't treat family like this. Richard would be appalled to see his sister treating his daughter with such cruelty." "You have no right," Mark began. "I have every right to question abuse when I see it," Albert interrupted. "There's a difference between discipline and cruelty. This," he gestured toward Tiffany's soaked form, "is not discipline." Mark's face reddened with anger. He lunged forward, grabbing Tiffany's arm and yanking her roughly to her feet. The child whimpered, her teddy bear falling into a puddle. In one fluid motion, Albert stepped between them. With a firm but controlled movement, he brushed Mark aside, breaking his grip on the child. Mark stumbled backward, nearly falling. Albert knelt before Tiffany, his eyes softening as they met hers. "May I?" he asked gently. The little girl gave an almost imperceptible nod. With careful movements, Albert lifted her into his arms. Tiffany's small body trembled against his chest, but her fingers clutched his jacket with desperate strength. For the first time since watching her parents' caskets lowered into the ground, Tiffany felt protected. The doctor's arms formed a fortress around her, steady and secure. She buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne and hospital antiseptic. The neighbors watched in silence as Albert cradled the shivering child, his posture transforming from confrontational to protective in an instant. No one dared interfere as the millionaire stood tall, the trembling orphan held safely in his embrace. Sylvia's face contorted with rage as she pointed an accusing finger at Tiffany. The little girl trembled in Albert's protective embrace, her small hands clutching her soaked teddy bear against her chest. "That child is nothing but a curse," Sylvia shrieked, her voice carrying across the yard. "Everything was fine until she came along. The fire, our financial troubles, it all started because of her." Her mascara ran in dark streaks down her cheeks, making her look almost monstrous in the fading light. Mark nodded vigorously behind his wife. "She's right. That kid's brought nothing but bad luck to this family." Albert's jaw tightened as he adjusted his hold on Tiffany, whose tears soaked silently into his expensive suit. The doctor's voice was measured but cold as ice. "There is no fairness in casting out a 7-year-old who has just buried her parents. What kind of people blame a child for their misfortunes?" Several neighbors had gathered at the fence, whispering among themselves. One elderly woman shook her head in visible disapproval of Sylvia and Mark's behavior. Another neighbor had his smartphone out, recording the confrontation. "You have no right to judge us," Sylvia spat. "You aren't here dealing with her nightmares, her constant crying. She's damaged goods, Warren." "The only damage I see," Albert replied calmly, "is what you've inflicted on Richard's daughter. Your own brother would be ashamed of what you've become." Tiffany pressed her face against Albert's chest, finding unexpected comfort in the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She couldn't remember the last time an adult had held her with such care, not since her father had carried her from the burning house. As Albert turned to leave, carrying the child toward his vehicle, Sylvia's shrill voice cut through the air once more. "You'll regret this, Warren. That inheritance belongs to us. She'll bring you nothing but misery. Mark my words." The threat hung in the heavy air as Albert carefully placed Tiffany in the passenger seat of his luxury car. The little girl watched his face for any sign that he might change his mind, that he might return her to the aunt and uncle who despised her. "Are you taking me to another relative?" Tiffany whispered, her voice barely audible. Albert buckled her seatbelt with gentle hands. "No, Tiffany, you're coming home with me." As the car pulled away from the curb, Tiffany stared out the window at the only home she had known since the fire. She wondered if this kind doctor would grow tired of her too. Adults always seemed to disappear when she needed them most. First her parents, then the neighbors who had initially offered sympathy but quickly moved on with their lives. Would Albert Warren be any different? Tiffany clutched her teddy bear tighter, afraid to hope but too exhausted to fear. The luxury vehicle glided through the darkening streets, its interior filled with a silence so thick it seemed to swallow every sound. Tiffany sat rigid in the passenger seat, her small fingers clutching her soaked teddy bear against her chest. The plush toy, once soft and comforting, now dripped water onto her already damp clothes. She watched through the window as unfamiliar buildings and streetlights blurred past, each mile taking her further from the only home she had ever known, even if that home had become a place of cruelty. Albert Warren adjusted the temperature control, turning up the heat another notch. His hands, steady during the most complex heart surgeries, now seemed clumsy as he tried to create some comfort for the shivering child beside him. He glanced at Tiffany, noticing how her shoulders trembled slightly, despite the warmth now filling the car. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. The 7-year-old gave no response, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, her mind clearly elsewhere. The surgeon sighed, uncertain how to breach the wall of trauma that surrounded her. Words of comfort had never been his specialty. He was more accustomed to clinical precision than emotional support. "I knew your father for many years," Albert finally said, his voice softening. "We were roommates in college. He was my best friend." Still, Tiffany remained silent, though her grip on the teddy bear tightened slightly. After 20 minutes, the car turned into a long, winding driveway. Tall oak trees lined the path, their shadows dancing across the vehicle's hood in the moonlight. As they rounded the final curve, Albert's suburban mansion came into view, a sprawling 2-story structure with warm lights glowing from several windows. "We're here," he said, parking in front of the main entrance. Tiffany finally turned her head, her swollen eyes widening at the sight of the enormous house. It was nothing like the home she had shared with her parents. Catherine and Richard had preferred cozy spaces filled with photographs and mementos. This place looked pristine, imposing, and utterly foreign. Albert walked around and opened her door, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Tiffany slid out of the car without taking it, still clutching her teddy bear like a shield. At the front door, she froze, her small body suddenly rigid with uncertainty. The threshold seemed impossibly wide, a boundary between her past life and whatever unknown future awaited. The weight of her grief, the shock of her aunt and uncle's betrayal, and the terror of this new uncertainty converged in that moment, rooting her feet to the ground. "It's all right," Albert said gently, standing beside her rather than pushing her forward. "We can take all the time you need." Tiffany took one small, halting step forward, then another, crossing into her new, uncertain life. Albert Warren led Tiffany through the grand entryway of his suburban mansion, the high ceilings and polished floors a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. The little girl's shoes squeaked against the marble, her wet clothes leaving small puddles in her wake. "I knew your father in college," Albert explained gently, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Richard was my closest friend. We stayed in touch all these years." He paused, searching for the right words. "I want you to know that you can stay here with me for as long as you need. This is your home now." Tiffany remained silent, her eyes downcast as she clutched her soaked teddy bear against her chest. The stuffed animal dripped onto the expensive carpet, but Albert didn't seem to mind. He guided her to a plush sofa in the living room, where she perched on the edge, looking impossibly small against the large furniture. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice gentle but uncertain. The heart surgeon was clearly more comfortable in an operating room than comforting a traumatized child. When Tiffany didn't respond, he tried again. "I know this is all very strange and scary. It's okay if you don't want to talk right now." The vastness of the mansion seemed to swallow her whole. Tiffany's eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, taking in the crystal chandelier, the abstract paintings, the sleek furniture that looked barely used. Nothing felt like home. Nothing felt safe. Albert ran a hand through his hair, clearly out of his depth. "I have someone I'd like you to meet," he said, disappearing briefly into another room. He returned moments later with a middle-aged woman whose kind face immediately softened upon seeing Tiffany. "This is Mary," Albert explained. "She's been my private nurse for many years." Mary approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Hello, sweetheart," she said warmly. "You must be freezing in those wet clothes. Would you like to change into something dry?" The nurse didn't wait for a response that wouldn't come. Instead, she disappeared and returned with a fluffy towel and what appeared to be a child's pajama set. "I keep these for when my nieces visit," she explained, placing them beside Tiffany. "And I've put some soup on the stove. Nothing fancy, but it'll warm you up." Tiffany remained huddled on the sofa, her knuckles white as she gripped her bear. The comfort offered by these strangers, however genuine, couldn't penetrate the wall of grief and fear surrounding her. Her parents were gone. Her aunt and uncle had thrown her away like garbage, and now she was here, in this beautiful prison with people she didn't know. Mary exchanged a concerned glance with Albert. They both understood this wouldn't be easy. Trust would take time, perhaps more time than any of them realized. The shadows grew long as night settled over Albert Warren's mansion. Tiffany lay curled in the guest bedroom, her small body dwarfed by the queen-sized bed. Sleep came reluctantly, dragging her into a realm where comfort and terror intertwined. Her fingers clutched her teddy bear, the last gift from her mother, as sweat beaded on her forehead. "Mom, Dad, don't go in there," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the darkened room. "Please, the fire, don't leave me." Down the hall, Albert sat in his study, medical journals untouched before him. Sleep eluded him as well. The heart surgeon's thoughts drifted to another child from years ago, his sister Emma, just 9 when pneumonia took her while he was away at medical school. He had promised to return for her birthday, but delayed his trip for exams. By the time he arrived home, it was for her funeral. "I should have been there," he whispered to the empty room, the familiar guilt washing over him. Now, with Tiffany under his roof, that same fear of inadequacy paralyzed him. What did he know about raising a traumatized child? Mary had gone home hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the orphaned girl down the hall. He checked his smartphone, 2 in the morning, and considered calling his nurse back, but pride stopped him. A piercing scream shattered the silence. Albert bolted from his chair, nearly knocking over a lamp as he rushed toward Tiffany's room. The child was sitting upright, eyes wide but unseeing, trapped between nightmare and reality. "Mom, Dad, don't leave me!" she screamed, her small body trembling violently. "Tiffany," Albert called softly, approaching the bed. "You're safe." "It's Albert!" The girl's eyes focused on him, recognition slowly dawning. "They were burning," she whispered. "I couldn't save them." Albert stood frozen at the bedside, his hands hovering uncertainly. Should he hold her? Would that frighten her more? The doctor who had held countless lives in his hands now found himself terrified of making the wrong move with this fragile child. "I'm here," he finally said, lowering himself to sit at the edge of the bed. "I won't leave you." Tiffany's breathing gradually steadied, her knuckles white around her teddy bear. "Everyone leaves," she murmured. The words struck Albert like a physical blow. He thought of Emma, of his promise broken, and of Richard and Catherine, gone forever while their daughter suffered. "Not this time," he said, his voice finding strength. "I promise you that." As Tiffany drifted back to uneasy sleep, Albert remained vigilant by her side, determined that history would not repeat itself on his watch. Mary's hands trembled as she placed another cold compress on Tiffany's forehead. The child's temperature had climbed to 103 degrees, her small body shivering despite the heat radiating from her skin. The teddy bear remained clutched against her chest, a lifeline in her delirium. "Dr. Warren, she's getting worse." Mary spoke urgently into her phone. "I've given her the medication, but her fever isn't breaking." Across town at Memorial Hospital, Albert Warren stood frozen in the surgical prep room. He had been minutes away from beginning a valve replacement on a 60-year-old patient when Mary's call came through. Without hesitation, he summoned the backup surgeon. "I have a family emergency," he announced, already removing his scrub cap. His colleagues exchanged surprised glances. In 15 years, the dedicated surgeon had never abandoned an operation. 20 minutes later, Albert burst through his front door, medical bag in hand. The sight that greeted him in Tiffany's bedroom sent a chill through his body. The little girl lay motionless except for occasional tremors, her face flushed crimson against the white pillowcase. "She's been calling for her parents," Mary whispered, stepping back to give him room. And asking not to be left alone again. Albert knelt beside the bed, gently taking Tiffany's tiny hand in his. Her fingers were burning hot, her breathing shallow and rapid. As a surgeon, he had treated countless patients, but this was different. This was personal. "I'm here, Tiffany," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." The child's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Promise?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I promise," Albert replied, squeezing her hand gently. As he worked to bring down her temperature, memories of his sister Sarah flooded back. Her fever, his parents away on business, his teenage self paralyzed with indecision until it was too late. The guilt had shaped his entire life, driving him to become a doctor, to save others when he couldn't save her. "History won't repeat itself," he whispered, more to himself than to Mary. "Not this time." Through the night, Albert remained vigilant, checking Tiffany's vitals, adjusting medications, refusing Mary's offers to take over. By dawn, the fever finally began to break, and the child fell into a peaceful sleep, still clutching her teddy bear. Miles away, in a house cluttered with unpaid bills, Sylvia paced nervously while Mark sat slumped at the kitchen table. "The bank called again," he muttered. "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage." Sylvia slammed her fist against the wall. "We need that inheritance. It should have been ours, not that brat's." "Our plan is falling apart," Mark replied, his voice hollow with defeat. "No," Sylvia hissed, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not finished yet. Not by a long shot." The kitchen table in Sylvia and Mark's house was littered with unopened envelopes, each stamped with bold red letters. "Final notice." Sylvia Thompson paced the room, her manicured nails tapping against her coffee mug as she calculated their dwindling resources. "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage," Mark mumbled, his shoulders hunched as he sorted through the pile. "The credit cards are maxed out, and the bank won't extend our line of credit." Sylvia slammed her mug down, coffee splattering across the bills. "Meanwhile, that little brat is sitting on a fortune. My brother's entire estate, our family money, going to waste on that child." Mark glanced up nervously. "But what can we do? The will is clear. Richard left everything to Tiffany." A cold smile spread across Sylvia's face as she pulled a folder from her purse. "Unless there's a newer will. One that names us as Tiffany's legal guardians and trustees of the estate until she turns 21. Her husband's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. That's fraud, Sylvia." "It's justice," she hissed, spreading documents across the table. "I found Richard's original will in his study before the fire. I've been practicing his signature for weeks." She produced several sheets of paper, with increasingly perfect forgeries. "All we need is to create a document dated after the original, with the right signatures and a couple of fake witness signatures." Mark ran his hands through his thinning hair. "This is insane. We could go to prison." "We'll be in prison anyway when they come to repossess the house," Sylvia snapped. "Besides, who would suspect? That doctor has no legal claim to her. We're blood relatives." Despite his reservations, Mark watched as Sylvia meticulously crafted the fraudulent document. His conscience flickered weakly, like a candle in a storm, but the thought of financial security extinguished it quickly enough. "What about fingerprints?" he asked quietly. "Won't they check?" Sylvia pulled out a glass from their china cabinet. "Richard drank from this at our last family dinner. I never washed it." She demonstrated how she planned to transfer the fingerprints using clear tape and ink. As night fell, the forged will was complete. Sylvia held it up triumphantly, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Tomorrow we visit our attorney. Within a week, that child and her inheritance will be ours." Miles away, in Albert Warren's mansion, Tiffany tossed in her bed, her fever finally breaking. Albert sat beside her, his surgical hands gently replacing the cool cloth on her forehead. As her eyes fluttered open briefly, he leaned close. "I promise you'll never be alone again. he whispered, unaware of the plot unfolding against the child he'd sworn to protect. Tiffany's fingers curled around her teddy bear as she drifted back to sleep, finding a fragile sense of safety for the first time since losing her parents. The morning sun cast long shadows as Mary walked Tiffany to school, her small hand trembling within the nurse's gentle grasp. 3 weeks had passed since the fever broke, and Albert had insisted Tiffany needed routine, despite his reservations about sending her back so soon. "Remember what we practiced," Mary said softly, adjusting the child's backpack. "If things get overwhelming, take 3 deep breaths." Tiffany nodded silently, clutching her teddy bear, the last gift from her mother, against her chest like armor. At the school gate, Tiffany froze. The familiar building now seemed imposing, filled with unknown dangers. Mary knelt before her, smoothing her hair. "Albert will pick you up at 3 o'clock sharp, I promise." Stepping into the classroom was like entering a spotlight. Conversations hushed as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Tiffany slid into her seat, keeping her gaze fixed on her desk, the teddy bear half hidden in her lap. "Look who's back," whispered Jason, a freckle-faced boy behind her. "The orphan girl." "Me! My mom says her parents died because they were careless," another voice added, just loud enough for Tiffany to hear. During math lesson, a note landed on her desk. "Orphans bring bad luck." Tiffany's eyes welled with tears, but she remembered Mary's advice and took 3 shaky breaths. At recess, the cruelty escalated. A group of children surrounded her under the oak tree where she sat alone. "Big babies need teddy bears," taunted Lisa, a girl with pigtails who had once been friendly. Before Tiffany could react, Jason snatched the bear from her hands, holding it high above his head. "Give it back!" Tiffany cried, her voice cracking as she jumped futilely. "Please, it's from my mom." "Your mom's dead," Jason laughed, tossing the bear to another boy. "She doesn't care about this stupid toy." Something inside Tiffany shattered. She lunged forward, tears streaming down her face, when a commanding voice cut through the playground. "What is happening here?" Mrs. Eleanor strode toward them, her normally kind face stern with authority. The children scattered, but Jason remained, the teddy bear dangling from his fingers. The teacher's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. "Hand it over, Jason, now." Her tone left no room for argument. The boy reluctantly surrendered the bear, which Eleanor gently returned to Tiffany. Kneeling beside the trembling child, she spoke with quiet conviction. "There is nothing wrong with holding on to something that brings you comfort, especially a gift from someone you love." She looked pointedly at the other children who had gathered to watch. True strength isn't in cruelty, but in kindness toward those who are hurting. Taking Tiffany's hand, Eleanor led her to a quiet corner of the playground. "Sometimes," she said, "the bravest thing we can do is simply survive another day." For the first time since entering the school gates, Tiffany felt she might actually be able to. The schoolyard emptied as children ran off to play, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence that surrounded Tiffany. She sat alone on a bench, clutching her teddy bear, the last gift from her mother, as if it might shield her from the curious stares and whispers. Eleanor Matthews approached quietly, her kind eyes taking in the child's isolation. "May I join you?" the teacher asked, sitting down without waiting for an answer. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a small blue notebook with stars on the cover. "Sometimes," she said, placing it gently in Tiffany's lap, "when words are too big to say out loud, writing them down makes them smaller." Tiffany traced her fingers over the notebook's cover, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Eleanor produced a pencil with a rainbow eraser. "You don't have to show anyone what you write. It's just for you." The child hesitated, then opened to the first blank page. Her small hand trembled as she formed the words, "I feel a little safer today." She stared at the sentence, surprised by her own admission, then quickly closed the notebook and clutched it to her chest, alongside her teddy bear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft Eleanor almost missed it. The teacher smiled, resisting the urge to hug the fragile girl. "You're welcome, Tiffany. Remember, brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means feeling scared and doing things anyway." When the bell rang, Eleanor gave Tiffany's shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading back to class. Throughout the afternoon, the child would occasionally open her notebook, adding another thought or feeling before quickly closing it again. As the final bell rang, students poured out of the building in excited waves, greeted by waiting parents. Tiffany sat beneath a large oak tree, her backpack and teddy bear beside her, watching as one by one her classmates disappeared. The schoolyard grew quieter with each passing minute. Just as the shadows began to lengthen, a luxury vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Albert Warren emerged, his face etched with concern as he hurried toward her. "Tiffany, I'm so sorry I'm late," he said, kneeling down to her level. "A patient needed emergency surgery, and I couldn't leave." She nodded, her eyes studying his face for signs of rejection. "I was afraid you weren't coming," she admitted softly. The surgeon's expression softened. "I will always come for you, Tiffany. I promise." He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. As they walked to the car together, Tiffany clutched her new notebook alongside her teddy bear. Two treasures now, one old and one new, both offering comfort in different ways. In the car, Albert noticed the notebook. "What's that you have there?" "A place for my words," she replied, and for the first time since the fire, the faintest ghost of a smile touched her lips. Whispers followed Tiffany through the streets of the small town like persistent shadows. "There goes the orphan girl," they'd say, voices hushed but loud enough for her to hear. "Poor thing brings bad luck wherever she goes." The rumors had started small, but grew like wildfire, fed by Sylvia's venomous words to anyone who would listen. "That child is cursed," she told the grocery clerk, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. First her parents, then who knows who else. The townspeople, already prone to superstition, latched onto these stories with morbid fascination. At school, Tiffany felt the stares and heard the murmurs. Children would move away when she approached the playground. Parents would pull their kids closer when she walked by. The 7-year-old clutched her teddy bear tighter each day, the worn plush becoming both shield and comfort against the world's judgment. "My mom says we shouldn't play with you," a classmate told her during recess. "She says bad things happen around you." Tiffany said nothing, retreating further into herself. That night, Albert found her curled in the window seat, staring at the stars. "No one wants to be my friend," she whispered, not looking at him. The doctor sat beside her, his heart breaking at her isolation, but unsure how to mend what the town had broken. The following morning brought matters to a head. As Mary walked Tiffany to the school entrance, a woman in an expensive coat stepped directly in their path. "You should be ashamed," the woman hissed, pointing at Tiffany. "Bringing that child here after what happened? My daughter has nightmares about fires now. She's bad luck, and everyone knows it." Several parents nodded in agreement. Tiffany shrank behind Mary, trembling as the private nurse tried to shield her. Just as tears threatened to spill, a commanding voice cut through the murmurs. "That is quite enough, Mrs. Peterson." Eleanor strode forward, her normally gentle teacher's demeanor replaced with steel. "The only misfortune I see here is adults teaching children to be cruel instead of compassionate." The homeroom teacher placed a protective hand on Tiffany's shoulder. "If anyone should be ashamed, it's those who persecute a child who has lost everything. Now, unless you'd like to discuss this further with the school board, I suggest you all move along." The crowd dispersed, muttering but chastened. Eleanor knelt before Tiffany, whose eyes were wide with surprise at this fierce defense. "Sometimes," the teacher said softly, "people fear what they don't understand. But you are not bad luck, Tiffany. You are a brave little girl who deserves kindness. For the first time in days, Tiffany's grip on her teddy bear loosened just slightly, a tiny seed of hope taking root beneath the weight of her sorrow. Tiffany trudged through the front door, her small shoulders hunched under the weight of another difficult day at school. The whispers had followed her through the hallways again, children pointing and parents exchanging knowing glances. Albert Warren noticed her expression immediately as she set her backpack down in the foyer of his spacious mansion. "Rough day?" he asked, setting aside the medical journal he'd been reviewing. Tiffany nodded, clutching her teddy bear tighter against her chest. She hesitated before looking up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think I bring bad luck too?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air between them. Albert felt as though someone had punched him in the chest. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "Tiffany," he said firmly, "you are the greatest blessing that has come into my life. Not bad luck, a blessing." The little girl's eyes widened slightly, doubt and hope battling across her features. "The people who say those things are wrong," Albert continued. "They don't understand that sometimes bad things happen that nobody causes. It wasn't your fault, not any of it." A single tear escaped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away with the back of a hand. For the first time in weeks, the faintest smile appeared on her face, like the first ray of sunshine after endless rain. "Can I go write in my notebook now?" she asked quietly. Albert nodded, watching as she climbed the stairs to her room. The seed of hope he'd planted was fragile, but it was there. Later that evening, as Albert reviewed patient files in his study, Mary knocked softly on the door. The private nurse entered, her expression unusually grave as she placed a plain brown envelope on his desk. "This was delivered for you," she said. "No return address, but the delivery person said it was urgent." Albert frowned, opening the envelope carefully. Inside were several photocopied documents, what appeared to be Richard's will, but with signatures that didn't match those Albert remembered seeing on previous legal documents his friend had shown him. A handwritten note accompanied the papers. "Sylvia and Mark are forging documents to claim Tiffany's inheritance. They need money desperately. The child is in danger. Act quickly." Mary gasped softly as she read over his shoulder. Who would send this? Albert's jaw tightened as he studied the documents. "Someone who knows the truth. Someone who's finally speaking up." He placed the papers back in the envelope, his decision already made. "Call James Carter first thing tomorrow. Tell him it's urgent." The battle for justice and for Tiffany's future was about to begin. Albert Warren sat across from James Carter in the study, sliding the brown envelope across the mahogany desk. The afternoon light filtered through half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the room. "This arrived yesterday," Albert explained, his voice low to avoid being overheard. "Anonymous, but clearly someone knows what Sylvia and Mark are planning." James Carter examined the photocopied will with practiced eyes. The attorney's brow furrowed as he studied the document, running his finger along the signatures. "The forgery is decent, but it wouldn't hold up under expert analysis," James said finally. "Unfortunately, this copy alone isn't enough evidence to take legal action. We need the original document, testimony about how it was created, or something more substantial." Albert rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident on his face. Richard would never have left everything to Sylvia. He knew exactly what kind of person his sister was. Outside the study door, Tiffany pressed her ear against the wood, her teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but hearing her father's name had stopped her in her tracks. "You need to prepare for a lengthy battle," James continued. "Sylvia will fight tooth and nail. She's desperate, and that makes her dangerous." "I promise to protect Tiffany," Albert replied, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't fail her like I failed my sister." The vulnerability in his tone made Tiffany's heart ache. She'd never heard the confident surgeon sound so uncertain before. We'll gather more evidence, James assured him. In the meantime, document everything. Any interactions with Sylvia or Mark, any threats, anything unusual. And keep Tiffany close. She's not just the beneficiary, she's potentially a witness. Tiffany tiptoed away from the door as the men continued talking. That night, after Mary had tucked her in, she pulled out the notebook Eleanor had given her. By flashlight, she began writing in her childish script. Dear Diary, Dr. Albert is worried about me. He thinks Aunt Sylvia wants to take my parents' things. I didn't know grown-ups could be scared too. He's always so strong, but today he sounded sad when he talked about his sister. I wish I could help him like he helps me. She paused, chewing on her pencil. Maybe I can be brave for both of us. I remember things about the night of the fire that I haven't told anyone. Things I heard Aunt Sylvia say when she thought I was sleeping. I'm going to tell Dr. Albert tomorrow. Maybe it will help. Tiffany closed the diary and tucked it under her pillow, her young mind determined to shoulder some of the burden that weighed so heavily on her protector's shoulders. The doorbell rang just as Albert was helping Tiffany with her math homework. Mary opened the door to find a thin, nervous woman standing on the threshold, clutching a worn handbag to her chest. Teresa Martinez, Mary announced, recognition flickering across her face. Albert rose from the table, his expression a mixture of surprise and caution. Teresa Martinez had been the Richard family's loyal housekeeper for over a decade before disappearing after the funeral. Tiffany peeked around Albert's tall frame, her eyes widening at the sight of the familiar face from her past. I'm sorry to come unannounced, Teresa said, her voice trembling slightly. But I couldn't wait any longer. Not after what I've discovered. Once seated in the living room, Teresa's weathered hands fumbled with her bag, extracting a small tape recorder. I was cleaning at Sylvia and Mark's last week. They don't know I work for 3 other families in town now. She placed the device on the coffee table. They were arguing in the study, and I recorded it. Albert exchanged a glance with Mary, who quietly led Tiffany to the kitchen. But the child slipped away and hid behind the doorframe, her teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest. When Albert pressed play, Sylvia's unmistakable voice filled the room. Once we get the inheritance, we'll be set for life. That brat won't get a penny of what should have been ours all along. Mark's hesitant response followed. But the signatures, what if someone notices they're forged? No one will question it if we play our cards right, Sylvia snapped. Teresa stopped the recording, her eyes filling with tears. There's more, Dr. Warren. Something I've been afraid to say. She twisted her hands in her lap. The night of the fire, I left late, around 9. I smelled something strange near the electrical box in the garage. Something chemical. Albert leaned forward, his face paling. Are you saying? The fire alarm batteries were new. I changed them myself that morning, Teresa continued. And I heard them arguing about insurance policies the week before. I didn't want to believe it, but... From her hiding place, Tiffany's small gasp was barely audible. The housekeeper's head snapped toward the sound, and her expression softened at the sight of the child. I should have come forward sooner, Teresa whispered, guilt etched into every line of her face. But I was afraid. They threatened my family if I ever spoke about anything I saw or heard in that house. Albert reached for the tape recorder, his hand steady, despite the horror coursing through him. You've been very brave, Teresa. This changes everything. Outside, thunder rumbled across the darkening sky, as if nature itself was responding to the revelation of a betrayal far deeper than anyone had imagined. The town courthouse buzzed with whispers as spectators filled every available seat. This wasn't just another inheritance dispute. It was the culmination of a tragedy that had gripped their small community for months. All eyes turned as Sylvia entered, her designer outfit and practiced smile projecting the image of a caring aunt wrongfully accused. Mark trailed behind her, his complexion ashen, fingers fidgeting with his tie. On the opposite side sat Albert Warren, his posture straight and unwavering. Beside him, Tiffany clutched her teddy bear, its worn fur a testament to countless tears and sleepless nights. The child's eyes darted nervously around the unfamiliar room as Albert leaned down to whisper reassurances. The defendants present this will, signed by Richard and Catherine, clearly naming Sylvia as Tiffany's guardian and beneficiary, announced Sylvia's attorney, his voice confident as he displayed the document. James Carter rose slowly, his experienced eyes scanning the courtroom before speaking. "Your Honor, this will is a forgery. The paper was manufactured after the deceased's passing, and the signatures don't match verified samples." He methodically presented enlarged photographs, pointing out discrepancies that caused murmurs to ripple through the audience. The courtroom fell silent as Teresa took the stand. The former housekeeper's hands trembled slightly as she identified a tape recorder. "I recorded this conversation in their kitchen 3 weeks ago," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. The recording played, filling the courtroom with Sylvia's unmistakable voice. "Once we have the inheritance, we'll send the brat to some boarding school." Mark's nervous laughter followed. "If the fire hadn't been so thorough." Gasps echoed through the room as an engineering expert testified next, explaining how the mansion's fire alarm had been deliberately disabled the night of the tragedy. "Someone removed these specific wires," he stated, pointing to photographs. "This wasn't an accident or malfunction." The judge called Tiffany forward. The little girl approached the stand, her teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest. When asked who she wanted to live with, she looked directly at Albert. "He's my family now," Tiffany said, her voice small but clear. "He promised he wouldn't leave me, and he didn't." The courtroom fell into profound silence. Even Sylvia's attorney seemed unable to respond as the child's simple truth hung in the air. The judge's gaze softened momentarily before returning to the stern expression required by his position. In that moment of quiet, justice seemed not just a legal concept, but a tangible force, gathering around the small figure clutching her teddy bear. The only witness who had lost everything, yet somehow found her voice. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the verdict, her voice clear and unwavering. Sylvia's face contorted with disbelief as the sentence was pronounced: 7 years imprisonment for forgery, fraud, and child abuse. Mark, standing beside her, trembled visibly as the judge stripped him of all inheritance rights, granting him only partial leniency for his 11th-hour confession. "This court finds the evidence overwhelming," the judge declared, removing her glasses. The systematic cruelty against a child who had just lost her parents demonstrates a callousness that this court cannot overlook. Sylvia's composure shattered completely. "You can't do this," she shrieked as court officers approached. "That money is mine. Richard would have wanted me to have it." Her designer jacket caught on the railing as they led her away, the fabric tearing, a fitting metaphor for her unraveling life. Mark stumbled toward Albert, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Please," he begged. "I didn't know how far she would go. I was weak, but I never wanted to hurt Tiffany." Albert Warren stood tall, one hand protectively on Tiffany's shoulder. "You stood by and laughed while your wife drenched a grieving child with a garden hose," he replied, his voice low but carrying across the now quiet courtroom. "Your weakness caused as much harm as her cruelty." James Carter gathered his documents, nodding slightly to Teresa, who sat in the back row, her testimony having sealed the couple's fate. The former housekeeper wiped away a tear, the burden of silence finally lifted from her shoulders. Outside on the courthouse steps, sunlight bathed the small group in warmth. Tiffany, still clutching her teddy bear, looked up at Albert with questioning eyes. "Do we have to hate them forever?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Albert knelt down, meeting her gaze. "There's a difference between forgiveness and excusing what someone has done," he explained gently. "We don't have to carry hate in our hearts, but justice matters. It protects people who can't protect themselves. Tiffany considered this, her young mind wrestling with complex emotions. Like you protected me? Yes, Albert replied, his voice catching slightly. And like your parents would have wanted. Eleanor approached, placing a supportive hand on Tiffany's back. You were very brave today, the teacher said warmly. Teresa joined them, nodding in agreement. Your parents would be so proud, she added. Tiffany looked around at the circle of adults who had fought for her, the surgeon who had become her guardian, the teacher who had defended her, the housekeeper who had revealed the truth. For the first time since the fire, she felt something unfamiliar yet comforting settle in her heart. It wasn't happiness exactly, but something just as precious. Security. Can we go home now? She asked Albert, her small hand finding his. Yes, he answered. We can go home. Sunlight streamed through the windows of Albert Warren's suburban mansion, bathing the living room in a warm glow that matched the atmosphere inside. Colorful balloons and streamers adorned every corner, transforming the once solemn space into a celebration of new beginnings. Today was Tiffany's 8th birthday, the first one she would celebrate in her new home. Eleanor arrived early, carrying a beautifully wrapped package containing art supplies. Mary had outdone herself with the decorations, her nurturing nature extending beyond medical care to ensuring this day would be perfect. Even Teresa had come, bringing a handmade quilt she'd been working on for months, each square representing a happy memory to replace the painful ones. Make a wish, sweetheart, Albert encouraged as he lit the 8 candles on the chocolate cake, Tiffany's favorite. The little girl closed her eyes, her face serene in a way that had seemed impossible just months ago. The teddy bear, now clean and restored, sat in the chair beside her, a silent witness to her journey. James Carter stood in the background, smiling quietly. He'd brought a savings bond for Tiffany's future education, practical yet thoughtful, just like the attorney himself. Classmates who had once whispered about her now laughed alongside her, their young hearts quicker to forgive and accept than their parents had been. When Tiffany opened her gifts, she did so with care and gratitude, thanking each person with growing confidence. The notebook Eleanor had given her months ago was nearly full now, pages filled with a child's processing of grief, fear, and eventually hope. Today, she would start a new one. I have something special for you, Albert said, kneeling beside her chair and presenting a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver locket with pictures of Catherine and Richard. So they're always with you, he explained, his voice catching slightly. Tiffany's eyes welled with tears, but they weren't the desperate tears of before. Thank you, she whispered, throwing her arms around his neck. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Tiffany helped Albert gather wrapping paper from the floor. I had the best birthday ever, she said, her voice small but steady. I'm so proud of you, Albert replied, his heart full. You've been so brave through everything. Tiffany looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a decision made in that moment. Thank you, Dad, she said, testing the word that had been forming in her heart for weeks. Albert froze, emotion overwhelming him. Then he gathered her in his arms, this child who had taught him that family wasn't just about blood, but about choosing to love through the darkest times. Outside, the sun began to set on the day, but for Tiffany and Albert, something new had just dawned, a family forged not in tragedy, but in the courage to begin again.